pandemic and exploring where we might go from here. The idea being let's go forward, not backward. And thank you, Stephanie Armstrong, for organizing us. Stephanie's been our slow food policy intern, and today's her last day. She put this all together. And Giselle, Lord, and Felix Way for being our technical support today. And then Anna Millay, our executive director, for putting equity, inclusion, and justice in the forefront of all aspects of slow food. This is so important to all of us on this call. Slow food is about good, clean, and fair food for all. Joy plus justice. And today we're going to explore with Jim Embry and Kanok Yisrael some ideas about how the COVID pandemic has made the inequities and vulnerabilities of our food system obvious to everybody. And then how can we take maybe an opportunity here and move forward, maybe even, as Jim would say, leap forward to a more equitable, more resilient new normal, as opposed to going back to the old fragile system, which obviously is a public health risk, is totally inadequate to our needs, and has put us all at risk. We're also thinking about the opportunity to transform our own organization to be equitable, inclusive, and just, what our own vision of the next 30 years could be for us as we work on creating a good, clean, and fair food system. So depending on your interests, we could do this kind of conversation with more people and change it into a set of conversations, but let's start here. Let us know in the end, did this conversation help you look at the challenges differently? Did we help you see a path forward to meaningful action? And who would you like to hear from to further develop these ideas? We'll leave about 15 minutes for questions, so type them in the chat boxes, as Giselle said, and we have a lot of ground to cover in the next 40 minutes or so. So Jim and Kanok, I'll ask you first, just give us a little bit of your basic information, what you're doing now in this time of the pandemic, what your connections are to slow food, and thank you both for taking time in this challenging time to talk to us about this important issue. So Jim, let's start with you.
All righty. Thank you, Charity, and just a big birthday greeting to Anna, our CEO of Slow Food USA. And I want to thank, like you, Charity, all the people who've arranged their time today to watch and listen in, and thank the people who have emailed me, I'm sure you all as well, who couldn't attend today, but plan to watch later on. Now, in regards to my connection with Slow Food USA, that began back in 2008 when I was chosen as a delegate to go to Italy for Terra Madre. But I've been involved in slow food as a cultural practice pretty much my whole life. I was born into a family where the principles of good, clean, and fair were part of the culture in this rural community where I live now, here in Kentucky, at the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains and at the watershed of Kentucky River. I began as a civil rights activist as a 10-year-old in 1959, and got involved, say, in food justice work around 1968 after attending the Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C., and also working for the summer in New York City. Now, back in 1971, my wife, I say wife and I, but it was really her, she began breastfeeding our very first child and the four that came after, because we felt that the very first best local food was breast milk. And then in 1972, after meeting Dick Gregory and adopting a plant-based diet, we both became founding members of a natural foods cooperative in Lexington, that was based upon three principles. Principle of local food, healthy food, and organic food. So when I met up with Slow Food in 2008, it was for me just a natural extension of what I had already been doing in my own life and the life of my grandparents and uncles and aunts and folks going back even to the years of enslavement. Now, regarding what I'm doing during the pandemic, well, I began, in mid-March, actually with a week and a half fast to help build my immunity system and kind of up my intake of garlic and echinacea and golden seal and things like that. But also, I began planting like crazy, planting much more, edible plants, flowers, trees, berries, bushes on our farm, but also turning about 15 acres of our land into a pollinator habitat to increase, of course, the rural area for pollinators. But I've also, like many people, I've also experienced virtual funerals for 2 or 3 members of the family who died during this time. But I've also incorporated weekly Zoom meetings with my children and grandchildren. That's been really wonderful. But also as an activist, my work never ends based upon who the president is or what we're dealing with in terms of pandemics or epidemics. My work is generally threefold. I try to make sure that I'm working on holding ground, holding the progress we've made, resisting the onslaught, which might take the form of demonstrations and things like that and protests. Secondly, I'm always trying to create alternatives, trying to affect structural changes. And then thirdly, I'm always trying to incorporate that third element of developing vision. So in my view, we must always work on all three levels, although our work might focus on particular areas. And I've been doing that, as you know, Charity, in the last few months within the Slow Food leadership, trying to project ideas. Let's put the snail on a skateboard. Let's get this 3 to 5 year plan for implementing the Equity, Inclusion, Justice Manifesto off the ground. Let's unlearn Newtonian thinking. Let's learn systems and quantum thinking. Let's connect that with indigenous traditional thinking. And let's create a 20, 30, or 40-year plan and vision for what it means to have a just and sustainable food system.
That's a pretty rich and thorough summary. Thanks, Jim. And I know, Kanoke, a lot of that resonates with you and all the activities you've been leading in Sacramento, California, and really across the country. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you've been up to?
All right. So thank you, Jim. I appreciate that. And one, like I said, I just want to say thank you to everybody who's here. Glad everybody's taking some time to embrace the new normal on Zoom. As you see in the background here, I'm sitting here outside. Probably see some plant starts behind me. One of the main things that we're doing right now, and what's so wonderful about the food system is that there's so many different places where people can get involved in it. And so there's never going to be a situation where you've got all these people doing all of the same thing. And there's always somewhere for somebody to fit in. So where we fit in that particular, we believe that people should be growing their own food, right? So when we start getting into some of the deeper ideas around resilience and all those different types of things, the main thing that we're probably going to be talking about is local, right? Bringing things back to local communities, local food production, redundancy, and all those different types of things. So, in 2011, my wife and I, Judith, we started the Yisrael Family Urban Farm. And so we're transforming the hood for good using urban agriculture to engage, employ, and empower the community. And so for the last 10 years, that's what we've been doing, whether it has to do with, showing people how to grow their own food, putting gardens in their yards, teaching classes, workshops, and things of that nature. Oh, okay. Somebody just asked a question. I'm situated in Sacramento, California. For Susan that just asked a question on the chat there. And so with that, I gotta go back a little bit, because how did I decide to get into this? Well, I came in on another demic, right? Whether it's a pandemic, epidemic, some kind of demic, and that was called the Great Recession, 2008, 2009. At that point, I was working in the computer field, and I was traveling around the country on the dime of corporate America, doing my thing, fixing computers, systems, all those different types of things. And of course, we had this situation to where some of the themes that were coming out of the media, of course, were like, oh, the world's going to end. It's going to be worse than the Great Depression. And people were scared. And so I was scared too as well. And so previous to that, I'd seen my parents struggle with their health, both of them having cancer. At some point, I didn't want to go that route. So I started, such as Jim, to start eating healthy, looking at plant-based diets, those types of things. Got a little helicopter going by, so if you can't hear me, let me know. But anyways, I started to really want to take what I'm eating seriously, and having a large family, then I started to realize that, wow, it costs a lot of money to be able to eat this healthy food. And so how could I directly impact that? And so, in 2008, 2009, my idea was, hey, here's the simple way to do this. Let's go and grow some food in the backyard. So that's what I did, with no previous experience, other than a couple of situations where my dad used to take me around to empty lots in our neighborhood when I was younger, which he had to drag me around and pick, greens that were growing. Had no other experience other than that. Went in my backyard, dug up some areas, started to, put some plants in the ground, and then, within a week, everything was dead. So that was kind of my first foray into the whole idea. But what I've realized over this period of time is that growing your own food is really like the gateway to another type of natural connection that we've lost. And so as we start to think about it, I'm sure, Jim, you can speak to this, and anybody else that's been around for some time, that at some point, we weren't able to go to a grocery store and eat food. And get food. We had to actually go to somebody, and there was a local economy that was built around food. And so I just wanted to start growing food in my backyard. So after many failures, I became successful. And then a few other things happened, such as now I'm pulling the family out. So every Sunday morning, it was, instead of getting up in the morning and sitting and watching cartoons or TV, it was where everybody's going out to work in the garden. And so we worked in the backyard, and first few times, of course, it was like pulling teeth. I had to, have very, very clever ways of getting people out there. But by the time it was 2 months in, everybody loved it, because then what else is happening? We're working together. We're now eating together. We're preparing meals together. We're harvesting together. So what we're really doing is we're actually building community with agriculture as kind of like the backdrop. So seeing that from 2000 and probably about 2008, 9 to about 2011, I was hooked. And then I decided to go ahead and trade in my corporate frequent flyer miles for seeds and soil. And I quit my job, and much to the surprise of Judith, my wife, I quit my job and said, hey, we're going to do this full time. Our lifestyle now is going to be agriculturally based, homesteading, whatever you want to call it. And so that's what I did. And so I wanted to take what we experienced as a family, what I experienced growing food, putting my hands in the soil, this connection to nature, to put it back into the world and put it back into my community, because I live in a food desert. This is a community that we live in, South Oak Park, Sacramento, California, is classified as a food desert. So I wanted to take what we were experiencing here in our little backyard and then kind of bring it out into the community. And that's where the Yisrael Family Urban Farm started. And so now, many of the things that we're doing is we're getting people to grow food. And I know that, in many cases, as we start talking about systems thinking, let me just propose this to you real quick. I could go and buy or go and get on 2 or 3 acres, and I could spend, me and maybe 4 or 5 other people. We could work our fingers to the bone, right? Trying to provide all this food so that people could come and get the food. Or, for example, an average tomato plant, maybe produces maybe about 8 to 12 pounds of tomatoes over its life. Well, since, maybe March or April, we've probably sold to people who are growing food, maybe I would say somewhere around 120, 130 tomato plants. And that's just one particular crop. You're talking about eggplants. So now there's at least 200 or so people that are in this neighborhood here in Sacramento who now have the ability and are growing food in their own backyards. And so what's happening is that these people are then going to start talking to each other. We make sure that those people that we have put gardens in their backyards, that we make sure that they get the chance to talk to each other too as well. So building a communal resilient food system between people who are now growing their own food is something that's very important to us. So that's some of what we're doing, and I'm sure we'll get into more as we go forward. So thank you with that, and I'll turn it back over to you, Charity.
Thanks, Kanoke. That's a great segue to the question that we had for Jim, which is you've talked about how our food and ag system has been hijacked. And that what Kanoke has just described, it's going on right in an urban area, is something you've also said in the late 1890s when your family started its farm in Kentucky. People were growing food everywhere, in rural areas and urban areas as well. The hijacking, of course, started in the late 1400s for the African Americans and the indigenous among us, but it's continued. So describe to us what you see the hijacking is, and a short historical view, and how do we get to this mess, and what is the mess in the way you describe it?
You're muted, Jim. Unmute
You're
yourself.
muted. You got to unmute yourself.
You're muted. There we go.
How's that?
Yeah, we got you.
That good? Okay,
yeah.
Wonderful. But this concept of hijacking deserves its own webinar, because not just the food and ag system, but every American institution and cultural expression has in some way or another been hijacked by the tentacles of what President Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, what Dr. King called the 3 evils of racism, militarism, and vulgar materialism, and what Bernie Sanders calls the 1%. So this American hijacking by multinationals, and so many of them, as we know, are agribusinesses, is now a global phenomena, and that's the mess that we're in. Now, the hijacking of what was largely a small-scale, organic, local and regional-based food and ag system has been quite well described already by the book by Wendell Berry, The Unsettling of America. So folks who are still somewhat sheltered and slowing down should add this to their pandemic period reading list for discussion with yourself and your family. Now, so the industrialized food system, again, controlled by these large agribusinesses like Monsanto and Cargill and so forth, they've been supported by, as we know, the federal government, as well as by universities who do a lot of the research and serve to carry out the values and principles of these large agribusinesses during this period of hijacking. So now let me just jump forward a minute to this idea of pandemic. So not only has this hijacking of the food system created this chemicalized, industrialized, commodified production system It has also created a kind of a Western diet, if you will, that is now globalized. And you see the results of the globalized Western diet and the pandemic impacts around the world. It's created a disease care system rather than a healthcare system, where our country leads the world in all the various disease indices is a result of this industrialized food system, along with ecological devastation, pollution of water and air and soil and things like that. So this has been part of this 100-year, if you will, hijacking of what was largely a resilient, locally based, largely organic ag system. Now, let me turn once again to Dr. King about a specific example of hijacking. Dr. King, in his last year, 1968, if you might recall, he wrote a book called Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? That's the question we're asking now. Where do we go from here? In that book, he said that under capitalism, he didn't believe we could achieve justice, racial justice, human justice. And he recommended in his book and his speeches that we then move towards democratic socialism. As you recall, in his last year, he was in Memphis supporting sanitation workers. As we know, sanitation workers are part of the food system because oftentimes they're the ones who are taking the food waste and disposing of them in a landfill. Sometimes we don't think about them as being part of the food system. He was also, as we recall, organizing the Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C., which was about economic justice for the working class and workers of every strata. We might also know that during those last couple of years, Dr. King and Cesar Chavez were meeting and talking and collaborating about how to make sure that farm workers, agricultural workers were part of this Poor People's Campaign, and how do we lift up economic justice for all working people. So Dr. King had a radical vision for what was needed in this country, a radical vision. But what happened after he died, his radical vision was hijacked, and what we got was a birthday celebration, oftentimes, that locks him into the I Have a Dream speech of 1963 and doesn't really fully develop his 5 years of growth over those 5-year period and what he was being critical of. Now, here's a specific example of hijacking. So after Dr. King was assassinated, there were urban rebellions, urban uprisings all across the country. People were demanding Black power, demanding Black people's control of all the affairs within our Black communities. The Panther Party had a 10-point program putting forward free healthcare, free food, and power to the people. And rather than getting those kinds of things, what we got was, the answer was Black capitalism. So friends who are listening, 20 years before the virus of McDonald's came to Italy, this virus hit the Black community. McDonald's came into the Black community in Detroit, Chicago, New York, and across the country and said, okay, the answer to economic justice, the answer to good health care is McDonald's and fast food. And McDonald's, what we call Black capitalism or racialized capitalism, hijacked this radical vision that Dr. King had put forward. And we then, McDonald's began sponsoring all the Black cultural festivals. It began giving money to all various different Black political politicians and so forth. Now, I recommend there's a book called Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America by Marcia Chatelain that lays out this specific hijacking that occurred within the fast food industry.
Wow, that's a lot of history, a lot of good recommendations about where we might go to learn more, and a good point. We could take an entire hour or more, several hours to talk about this. So I'll go, and it seems so overwhelming with capitalism at the core of it. But Kanok, I know you've said from the beginning that you're a person of action. You've taken action. You've created your farm. You've also stepped into policy activity and advocacy, which I've witnessed as I've seen you speaking at City Hall to make it legal for you to sell your food from your yard, and also the Farmer Equity Act in California. So tell us a little bit about your journey into policy and how Slow Food might be active and effective in promoting policies that can help undo this hijacking.
Okay, I'll go ahead and approach that. Well, so one thing that also I want to kind of touch on also is with everything that Jim said, is that from a personal level, is that you end up with a group of people who don't understand how much power that they have. So this idea of power is now this otherworldly external thing that somehow we have to then try to go and get from somebody. Like, oh, let me go and talk to somebody so we can give me power, or let me go and talk to this person so I can get power. When in reality, what happens is that everyone has power. It's just how you determine how you connect to it and how you use it. So going back to some of those things that Jim was talking about in the past, when you look at some of the things such as Booker T. Washington and what he did at Tuskegee University with black farmers, George Washington Carver, and then here in California with Colonel Allensworth, how he took the idea of what was happening with Booker T. Washington as a student of his, and then came to the Tulare County, bought some land, and actually established and built a city there in Tulare. So those are the types of ideas that as I started to learn more about agricultural history and things, those are the types of models that I kind of latched on to. So looking at, starting to grow my own food and being able to say, wow, people are paying $4 a pound for tomatoes at a store that's 7 minutes away. I can get a pack of seed for, $4 or $5, and then grow 20, 30, 50 tomato plants, and then have enough to feed myself, and then be able to have enough surplus to then either give some away, sell some, trade with somebody, those types of things. Then I experience a personal power surge within myself. And then from that point, then I'm like, okay, well then, yeah, I want to be able to sell my produce. And so then going to try to do that, and then finding out that those things are illegal, right? That's an illegal practice. You can't actually sell produce. You can grow as much as you want, but you can't really sell it. So then it's like, at that point, we have we put together a coalition, Urban Agriculture Coalition here in Sacramento. And with that coalition of different people, we were then able to put together an ordinance and then take that ordinance to City Hall. They voted on it. So now you can grow food in Sacramento, and then you can actually sell it on a farm stand, which we've taken advantage of. And there's many other people and other urban farmers in Sacramento taking advantage of that. And so, like I said, for what I see here is a personal transformation of people, personal transformation taking place within the minds and hearts and souls of people, which says, after you harvest that first tomato, you're like, okay, I can actually, I can powerfully connect with this entity called nature, which for the most part, most people ignore, and then be able to do something with it. So I'm not as powerless as I thought I was. So now that you've realized it, then how do you then apply this to some of the larger systems? And so that's kind of what, how I got into the whole idea of, let's take a look at policies and take a look at a larger idea of systems thinking as it relates to the food system. Now, when we start talking about, just the whole idea of hijacking, I kind of don't really like the term hijacking because it really doesn't. It's almost like the term food desert, right? Because when you think of a food desert, you think of something. Oh wow, okay, maybe there was food there at some point, and then somehow it just declined. When in reality, unequal conditions are planned to be that way. So whether we call it colonialism or capitalism or white supremacy, we call it food apartheid, it's all the same thing, where for the most part you have non-white people being exploited by systems that are put up by people who are white. And so that's when you start to talk about hijacking, then that's where it starts with me. And as I'm sitting in my community here, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, I couldn't even go and buy a house 5 to 10 blocks away. It was impossible. So, those are the types of structural inequities that end up creating these situations that, we're now in as it relates to health, et cetera. If you give me your, if you go ahead and give me your zip code, I can pretty much tell you how long you're going to live. So in all of this information, I started to come in contact with as I started to study more about the food system, which all started from that seed that I planted in my backyard. So that's where this whole thing happens to me, and that's why I'm always, in addition to working locally, then you also have to look at regionally, and you also have to look at statewide and even national as well.
I hear the chickens in the background, so I know that was another policy win in Sacramento. It wasn't legal. Yeah, and then a lot of us within Slow Food and the various groups that we work with, like the Rural Coalition, like the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, California Food and Farming Network, I know you're part of that, are working on those policy changes, and it's a pretty daunting task right now, but we keep hearing that people are really happy when Slow Food signs on to a bill or a letter, or there is power in numbers. So that's gratifying, and I think you've really demonstrated it. Maybe just a little bit about the Farmer Equity Act, and then we're pretty close to having to wind up and ask some more questions about how do we change our thinking. I know, Jim, you have a lot to say about the innovations that we're talking about. Just say a little bit about the Farmer Equity Act, and then we'll go to Jim and those innovations.
So really just the Farmer Equity Act was, that was the Farmer Equity.
Whoops, we lost Canuck. So maybe Jim, I know the innovations that we're talking about, cooperatives, CSAs, school breakfasts, a lot of those mutual aid societies have long roots in the African American community, and people are talking about them around the country. How can we bring that forward and do things differently? Where do we look for inspiration, and how do we get to a different system?
Absolutely. Yeah, the period that we're in now, again, the period of structural change and creating alternatives. Then I think within Slow Food USA and within all the other groups that relate to food and ag, we ought to lift up certain kinds of alternatives being very important. And one of them is what we call mutual aid, solidarity economy, cooperatives. They've been part of our history in many ways as farmer cooperatives throughout the South. And the kind of like the current work around local food, healthy food, and things like that was in many ways inspired by that resurgence of cooperatives during the 70s that I was part of. So we ought to have, again, webinars, seminars throughout the states on the history of cooperatives, how to farm cooperatives. A friend of mine named Jessica Nimhard has a great book called Collective Courage that kind of focuses on, if you will, the role of co-ops within the Black liberation struggle. The book Farming While Black by Leah Penman. In her book, she talks about, again, these structures that we can begin to create in every community that provides a kind of a transition, if you want to call it that, to this more just and sustainable space that we're trying to move towards. I think Canucks, let him go ahead and jump into the policy question.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. I don't know what happened. Somebody calling, and then the next thing you know, it just kind of kicked me off. So aside from that, I'm back. So just talking about the Farmer Equity Act, really. So let's just kind of look at the climate here. In the days of the 60s or 50s or 40s, we're in what's called the North up here. So most of the reason why people are here is because they were trying to escape the types of conditions that were on plantations as it relates to food. So as you start to come way out here to California, people were coming here to get out of the whole idea of agriculture and farming. People were coming here to escape. They called it the Great Migration that took place. And so being here, especially in Sacramento, where you got the farm to fork capital, there's not many non-white farmers who are able to make it, especially when you start talking about California. And so what happens is that we just become marginalized. So there's very few farms, and then because you don't have access to lobbyists and different things that some of the larger commercial thousands of acre farms have, then many of the resources that should be going to quote unquote minority farmers or socially disadvantaged farmers end up going to other communities and other people, i.e., for example, if a woman-owned business, then of course qualify for being socially disadvantaged and minority. So, all I have to do now is my 1,000-acre farm and put it in somebody else's hand, and then now I have access to those resources, right? So what we did is got together with farmers here in California, and we were saying, okay, what are the things that we need from the Department of Food and Agriculture, and we then advanced some legislation that will create an act so that the CDFA would then have to create a position for someone to have to go and do research about what's in the non-white farmers or socially disadvantaged farmers in California, and then figure out ways to make sure that we have access to, and even in many cases, awareness of those funds so that we can start to take advantage of those things. And so that's in a nutshell, Farmer Equity Act. And so with that, there's also been we've also come together with a few other groups as well. CAP is part of that group, as well as many others. And what we're doing now, we're trying to figure out how to, benefit from that legislation passing, because it's an uphill and slow battle. It's slow, but not in the way that we.
Well, it was a success, and there is an officer, so there is somebody to talk to, and congratulations to you, and thank you for that work. So we're at the point where we should be taking questions, but Jim, what is a slow food that embeds equity, inclusion, and justice at every link? Look at you. How do we come to that, realizing that vision?
Okay.
Short of a farmer equity officer.
Yes. Well, one thing that could be part of this is that when we go to Terra Madre, they have over there people from about 180 different countries that come to Terra Madre. There are fisher people, herds people, small farmers, educators, youth, all kind of folks are there. Well, in our country, I'll bet you there's people here who live here now from all those countries that are in Terra Madre. Well, our chapters, our regional structures ought to be committed to, let's make sure that we're reaching out in our communities to all the people that we see in Italy at Terra Madre, okay? As being members, as being people that we're related to, that we're engaging with, collaborating with, supporting in all kinds of ways, okay? Is how it would look in that kind of a way. And it's such a joyful experience to have is to connect up with, right in your own community, all the world's people who are right here. That's one thing. And then we want to make sure that the USA's demographics is reflected in our leadership, whether it's leadership at the national level in terms of staff, board, governors, and things like that. Chapter leaders ought to be a part of that. But also we ought to be committed to embedding ourselves in our communities, reaching out to all the people around our community, all the people in our communities of different ethnicities, different faiths, and so forth, where we're supporting what they're doing, and we're engaging them in what we might call then specific slow food kind of projects. And lastly, we must be collaborating with the 50, 100, or 200 other food and ag groups. And we're meeting on a regular basis. We're supporting each other. We're collaborating. We're building a movement that the chapters that we have in slow food who are in states with HBCUs are meeting those folks at the HBCUs. They're involved. They're connected. They're providing internships for students and things like that. But we're also embedding ourselves in the traditional wisdom, the indigenous wisdom of the folks who have been in Turtle Island for 30 or 40,000 years. We need that kind of historical, ancient, present day wisdom relationship that's sacred. We need that to be synthesized, like how system thinking and quantum thinking.
Well, that is a joyous vision. So thank you for laying it out. I hope this conversation has been part of a step toward that, a big step. And I see that we have questions. So I think right now I better turn it over to Felix to give, or Giselle to give us the questions for our panelists. And thank you both, Kanoke and Jim, for taking the time and,
Thank you, Charity.
and involving us in this vision.
You are quite welcome.
Yes.
I'll echo that. Thanks. This is a really wonderful conversation, some really important points, and I am learning things. There's also a lot of interest in some of the books you're recommending with Jim. I know you kind of listed them out, but would love to follow up with this group with maybe that list of books and some links to more information from our panelists today. So I'm going to jump into these questions for you two, and one of our questions is for Kanoke and is referencing let's see, some contentious and emotional responses to the idea of gardening as a way to increase food insecurity. In essence, the effect that it can transfer the responsibility of dealing with food insecurity onto the individual and away from society or government, and implies that it's our responsibility to feed ourselves and our fault if we can't. So, and also to reference the folks that physically can't grow their own food or simply don't have the time because maybe they have 3 jobs and many children or whatever the case may be. So can you comment on this debate or how to approach the problem without leaving one or both sides feeling angry or disenfranchised?
Well, yeah, you can, because once again, as far as when we're talking about people growing their own food, that's one aspect. What we're really talking about is creating resilient communities. And I think that when you start talking about resilience, you are talking about, when you start looking at resilience, even taken from nature, one thing in nature only serve one thing. there's everything is all connected together. Everything is working together in some kind of way. So I think that both sides of this are can be represented and dealt with. But it really does come, like I said, once again, it does really come back to certain types of things. We probably don't have a whole bunch of time to address there, but I do think that what I'm talking about when I'm talking about growing food is I don't look at growing food as the, but what it does is when you start to do it, even if it's you put something in a pot and you grow it, you grow it on your balcony or something like that, then there's something that happens within you that then has you to start looking at things differently. And I think that that's what's, important to understand, because most, and I'm not, and I'm looking at myself because I grew up as a person who, my only idea was to get on the treadmill, and then start to run the race run the rat race of trying to survive. And so when I kind of was able to divert some of my something different, then it turned into other things, and then here I am now. So I think that there's a way to look at that from both aspects. But I think again, there is some kind of personal responsibility for things that happen, and I think that that's important to understand.
Jim, I just want to leave a moment in case you want to comment on that idea as well.
Well, I think that the eating of food, we say a blessing. We think that's a sacred sacrament. In my view, every part of the food system is a sacred relationship, whether it's the planting, the production, the distribution, how you retail it, how you market it, and how you dispose of it. These are all, in my view, sacred relationships and connections. And I feel that everybody should grow something because it connects you with what you're made from. It connects you with the soil that you're made from. So it's a part of a spiritual practice. So I would say to people, get a jar, get some seeds, sprout in your house. Make sure that your workplace provides time for a garden. Make sure that your faith institution, your church, synagogue, mosque, is developing these gardens of creation that are edible gardens. In your apartment complex, I do work with people in apartment complexes, and we find land that they can work in. I'm just saying, take the proactive thought to be innovative, to be creative, and how can I engage in this spiritual practice, this connection with what I'm made from, in whatever ways that are possible. That would be my encouragement.
Great, thank you. An important comment, I think, on the perspective of that one thing doesn't necessarily discount or eliminate, that things can work together. Systems, actions, activities don't need to sort of discount others, that it's a big picture situation. And speaking of the big picture situation, our next question is, with the shifts in food supply and demand from COVID-19, what can everyday people do to support a better food system going forward?
I'd like to jump in on that one. And I think it just kind of goes back to, the whole idea of local. I mean, just taking that extra time to find the local choice for the things that you need to have, because once again, that's one of the ideas of resilience is understanding that this pandemic, it's showing a lot of things about the food system, but there's going to be another one. It's not like this, okay, got this out of the way and it stopped. There's going to be other things that are like this that are going to continue to happen. And so starting to build local networks of people who may have to work 3 jobs, but then understanding that, okay, maybe there's somebody within the local community that can be supported. Our farm, we do, when we do sell food, we sell food, we sell, plant starch, many of those things, people, are on EBT or CalFresh, those types of things, then they those things from us. And so what that does is then we're in the same neighborhood, so then they don't have to pick and then try to go, 10, 12 miles, 5 miles, or 4 miles, whatever, to go and get those resources. So you're starting to build a local economy, I think, is one thing that's very important.
Jim, do you want to add anything else to that?
Yeah, I would say, just to reinforce, I've mentioned already several books. The way to change things is to know about the history of how we've gotten where we are and some idea of where we're headed. So read books, read articles, watch videos. Within the Farming While Black, Leah talks about rituals, creating in your life rituals around food. Recognize the importance of water. Do a water ritual. Do a soil ritual. Things like that as part of your everyday kind of practice. Save seeds. Learn who in your community, who in your state are the great seed savers. Go to the seed swaps. When you grow things, if you're growing heirloom or other kinds of varieties, save seeds. Learn about the importance of saving seeds, and to as a way to stop the monopoly on seeds by various corporations. Know your farmers, has been said. Know your restaurant owners. Get involved in your schools, in your school gardens, and things like that. But also it's important, as it's been pointed out, we have to find ways to affect policy changes at the local level, within our school boards, within our faith institution, local governments, state governments, federal governments, to affect policy, but also begin thinking about what would it look like to create this resilient, sustainable, healthy food system. What would it look like? Project 50 years down the road, and then backtrack it. It's called, scenario planning. Backtrack it to say, okay, or to get there in 30 years, I must do these kind of things today, tomorrow, the next 3 years. But have a sense of a vision of where we're headed.
And another thing, if I could add real quick, is also to talk to your elders. I started doing some research and talking to my elders to come to find out that my great grandfather in Texas was a farmer. He was a landowner. He probably had about 100 or so acres. And the thing is that if you go back 2 generations, many of the things that we're talking about, as Jim has stated and what have you, these were regular practices. If I go back 2 generations, go to my grandmother's house, she had toilet paper. I mean, it wasn't a situation. And then when you look in her cupboards, she had food that was canned. She had jam. She had a big garden. Why? Because someday she may need it. She prepared and she planned for those things. So those skills in many cases are still there with the elders, and talking to them, they're more than willing to share, because even here I've found a lot of elders that I've talked to that shared much wisdom about food and how it was back then. That's something I wanted to also add.
Excellent. Thank you both. That's excellent. And I think that this is such an important time to stay informed. I know that's sort of personally, that's been my journey at this time, that I can engage with this local food system, but being a part of a conversation like this, or listening, reading those books, kind of being better informed than I have been in the past to understand what's wrong and what I personally can do about it. So thank you for that. A couple more questions if we can keep you. We're at the hour, but if it's all right with you guys, we'll go on with a couple less questions. There's just 2 of them. How can we improve the connections between families who grow some of their own food and local farmers with the approach of a regenerative system? I think my thought is that regenerative systems, again, another thing that could be a conversation in and of itself, I believe, but maybe touching lightly on what that might mean in a local food community.
Great, Canuck.
Well, when you think of community, you're talking about having redundancy and backup. those types of things. You're also talking about diversity of complementary type of enterprises. Like, for example, in addition to, what we do here, we first out, okay, we're going to grow a bunch of food and we're going to feed people and those types of things. But then at some point, people were like, well, I want to buy some plants to start my own garden. So then it was like, okay, now we have to start growing plants and then selling those plants. So that's an enterprise. And then also, there's people who want to be able to put gardens in their backyards, but they don't know how, those types of things. And so there's all these complementary different types of enterprises that you can do. I think there's innovation that has to be encouraged, and having like urban rural type of connection where you have the bigger farms and the smaller farms in the city, that there's some type of connection. Like we partnered with other farmers, such as Negro Farms and Three Sisters Gardens that are in West Sacramento, to where people can pick up, their food box from us, and then vice versa, can pick up our products from them. So I think that there's a lot of ways that we can start to, build that resiliency. Time, it really just has to do with imagining and looking at things different, and then understanding that you try something, and then there's things are gonna fail, and then you have to kind of dust yourself off and try again. It can get like the way that we are in like 10 days or 10 years. This has been hundreds of years. So there's many things we're gonna have to try, and we're gonna have to fail and be able to innovate and continue to keep going, as things are happening. So sometimes we get scared enough, oh, well, I don't know what's going to happen, or nobody's ever done this before, so I'm just not even going to try. And I think that that's an important thing to understand.
Can I add a thought? When it comes to this idea of regenerative agriculture, the word is used, I think, globally, agroecology and things like that. Part of the response is we need a great remembering that, first of all, that humans were farming for about 12,000 years based upon these principles of ag that was regenerative, okay, for 12,000 years. It wasn't until around World War I and more after World War II that there was this great experiment that said, well, we've come back from the wars with all these chemical weapons. Let's convince the farmers, let's convince the people, the citizens in the United States, that what we need now is a different kind of a farming and food system where we fill up the fields with all kinds of chemicals, fertilizers, herbicides, things like that, pesticides. We fill up the soil with those. We fill the water and the air with similar pollutants. And then what we also do, we take those same kind of chemicals, we put them into food. We call it processed food, junk food. You can't even call it food. And we wonder then if the environment can survive in a healthy kind of a way. Can the people survive being filled full of chemicals and processed and kinds of foods? And now we're recognizing with the pandemic that experiment has failed. We see the results of that kind of industrial farming mentality. So we need a great remembering to say that this wasn't always this way, right, and that there were people like Washington Carver who spent 50 years at Tuskegee talking about these same principles of farming in a way that was regenerative. He wrote 40-some bulletins on how to use and plant almost every kind of a seed, how to do canning, preserving, drying, you name it. So part of the work ought to be going back to say, let's all find the links to Carver's bulletins, put them on our bookshelf, study them, and things like that. And also begin to, the great remembering is that we are all indigenous people. First of all, we're all indigenous to the earth. But we have also, if you look back in our families, you go back 100 or 200 years, we all come from indigenous communities. So part of our responsibility is to have a great remembering about how did the folks in Europe and North America, South America, Africa, Asia, who were indigenous and traditional, how did they live? What were their principles and values? And have this great remembering of then of incorporating these, what we tend to call indigenous traditional wisdoms with this idea of systems and quantum science. So a great remembering, I think, would be an important part of our work to create within our communities this idea of regenerative agriculture and solidarity economy and a sense of resilience.
Thank you both very much. All right, we're going to ask one more question. Is that all right? Do you guys mind hanging out for a few more minutes to get to this one last question?
Sure.
Okay, great. So the last question, I'm going to let you all take a look at the context of Faiza's question, but the idea is that there's a city touting a partnership with a nonprofit farming organization, but also allowing a light industrial facility across from a park and within a half a mile of a few schools. So how can we use our personal power in an instance like this to get a city to take a people first approach to stop unhealthy and unwanted businesses in a neighborhood, or businesses that don't support resilience? What's the personal power? Like, what is the thing that I can do as an individual that might affect change there?
You saved this one for last, huh? Well, you know, it's one of those things. I mean, I probably won't be able to give you the solution because, you know, first of all, you know, if I'm going to borrow from indigenous thinking, every environment is going to be different. So what may have worked here in Sacramento, California, may not necessarily work in somewhere else. So the main thing that you have to do is you're going to have to look at the landscape of what's going on there. And I can't, you know, for example, if I've had people that have asked me to help them design their lands, and I've said, okay, well, get back in a year. And they're like, why? I said, unless you observe this environment for at least a year with certain types of eyes, seeing it through all its different seasons, then we have to figure out where's going to be the best way to be insert ourselves or insert something into this place or into this environment, and then be able to start to try to change. It's a question that I would probably have to say, it depends on that, just because, you know, I just don't have information really to really lay out. I can tell you what here, which was one, you know, we went and looked all around the United States at other people who had done what we're trying to do, which make food legal to be able to grow it and then sell it. And then we kind of gathered a bunch of best practices. We talked to a lot of people. If you're going to interface with a government agency, especially a city council, try to make it so that they don't have to think about anything. You want to do all of your work on your end, so that all you have to do is say, here, we've done all the work to be able to come up with what it is that we want. We just need you to sign it. Because if you say, hey, would you design it for us? Well, then, of course, you know, as we talked about, it's probably going to be designed according to the same things that, you know, probably got the situation to be where it is, where somebody wants to change it in the first place. So, I mean, those are just a couple of things that we've done here to kind of get the process started in that particular way. But I'm sure that if whoever asked that question, I mean, if you're interested in really exploring that, you know, deeper, then, you know, get in contact with me. We can talk.
Jim, do you want to add anything else to that, or do either of you want to add it? That's our last question, and though I know it was a harder one, I think that was a very valuable response.
I would add that I'm a believer in the power of one, but also in the greater power of the many. And that all through our history, we see examples of individuals stepping up and taking for themselves a certain responsibility to affect change. And that's wonderful. But the things that we're faced with, I call it these viruses, these pandemics of these large multinational folks that have no allegiance to any country are going to require us to have a greater collective, collaborative approach to how we live and how we act. Now, I would also add that within our Constitution, we have what's called a Bill of Rights that has been reinforced along the lines of individualism, that we have all these different kind of rights. What we also need in terms of this idea of food and ag and kind of changes is now a Bill of Responsibilities. If I'm in favor of, let's say, the Second Amendment, what's my responsibility about owning and using, say, weapons and guns? What's my responsibility? What's my responsibility to my community around me? My community meaning human people, the community that's the water people, the air people, the plant people, and so forth. So part of our struggle for the question of justice has to also include how do we create justice for the other people in our environment, the justice for the soil, the animal people, the rock people, the plant people, the air people, and so forth. Now, around the world, there has been this development of what's called these laws or rights of Mother Nature, okay, or Mother Earth. So how do we begin to say within your city council, within your state government, how do we get the city council to begin passing laws that are similar to these laws about the rights of Mother Earth within the laws that govern our city, state, and federal governments? So I had mentioned earlier that I just feel that in terms of movement building, we should think about operating and working on these three levels. One is resistance, resisting the onslaught that's occurring all around us, holding ground, holding progress. Second is working together or with all kinds of groups to create structural change, alternatives. And thirdly, developing vision of that concept that we hear often, that another world is possible. And Slow Food USA represents that kind of entity, that kind of international network that can invite people to get on board, jump on the skateboard, okay, where the snail is at, and let's endeavor to work collectively. Let's work collectively, collaboratively towards that another world is possible.
Well, that's a great conclusion to a great conversation. And I do hope that we'll have some interest in joining Slow Food. We're interested in joining with you as well. We do believe that we have to work collectively. We are working on that vision of a good, clean, and fair food system for all, joy plus justice. And these are the kinds of people you'll meet if you join us. So Kanoke and Jim, I really treasure your friendships and your leadership and wisdom. And I got to know you through Slow Food, so I think it's a good example. Giselle, of course, I met you through. So this is the kind of community that we're building, and this vision that you're helping us lay out, I think is tremendous. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having us on, and
thank you all. Thank you all.
Time with us.
Thank you all so much for this conversation. This is really valuable, and I hope to do more of it in the future. We've recorded this, so we'll put it up as a blog post so the folks that weren't able to join today can watch later, and we'll send out an email to all of you with how to keep up, and a book list. We're gonna get a book list from Jim. And I also want to mention that just to sort of echo Jim's call to partner with other organizations and other groups and entities that are doing work in agriculture and food and beverage and all of these ways. If you are part of an organization and are interested in exploring a partnership or exploring how we can collaborate and support one another, Slow Food and your organization, please reach out to us. There's a contact page on the Slow Food USA website where you can kind of see the right person to reach out to, or just fill out that contact form. We would love to talk to you. I think that's true for all of our working groups and committees, that I really would love to cultivate these connections and partnerships with other people doing really great work in the same space. So please reach out if you are one of those people. Thank you so much to the three of you for being with us today and for offering your insights and wisdom. We will check in with you soon. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. I hope you all stay safe and healthy.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Bye.